what? That seems so long ago. I mean, it is so long ago, isn't it? God, I can't believe it. Um, and I think it's a testament to the incredible fandom of Stargate that there still seems to be an appetite for things Stargate and information, and hopefully, fingers crossed, one day a new series. But yeah, I'm delighted to be here. So thank you very, very much for having me. I know we've tried multiple times to get this to work, and due to various schedule conflicts and that, we haven't been able to do it. But here we are. So.
Here we are. Here we are. No better than the present time. Suanne, I'm just sort of intrigued about this concept in terms of Hathor, in terms of what were the producers and directors originally looking for in terms of Hathor when they came up with this idea? Had they had it in mind for an English sort of speaking actress, a different sort of a tone of voice in terms of what was sort of different to maybe Nirti and Jacqueline Samuda's character in terms of projection? Because it almost felt that Hathor sort of stood out in terms of the other sort of cast members in terms of that presence. And an awful lot of that, I say, goes to the tone of your voice as well.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if that was intentional. I mean, there is a story, and I don't know, the sort of urban myth on Stargate. I don't know if this is true, but it was relayed to me. One of the producers had been married to Sharon Stone, and originally Sharon Stone was tagged to play Hathor. And over that summer, she did a little itty bitty film called Basic Instinct.
Okay.
And of course, the film exploded and became a mega hit. And she was no longer doing Stargate. So they cast the net very wide. I mean, I was not privy to any of those discussions about what exactly they were looking for. It was very much like any audition. I was handed, and I wasn't even actually given the full script. I was handed what they call sides, which are just the pages of dialogue. And oh, sorry, my water bottle just went. um, and oh, it's done it again. What's going on? It's the go olds.
Yeah.
And I went into audition, and the one interesting thing I do remember from the audition was that it was sort of midsummer in Los Angeles. It was like July, I think, or something, or June. I was very, very hot, and I had broken my toe, my sort of middle toe, and so I wasn't able to wear closed shoes. And at this audition, at this casting, there were like about 70 women all going in for Hathor, who were all dressed. I don't know. I was like, did I not get the memo? Because everyone was dressed very, very sexily, very provocatively. Like there was a lot of sort of satin shift night, sort of almost nighty like looking dresses. And I was in a pair of trousers because I prefer them anyway, and sort of flip flops because I couldn't wear closed shoes. So I looked ridiculously casual. And I only remember when they handed me the pages, it was all slightly out of context. And the scene that we did for the audition was when she first arrives and she's handcuffed, and when she says those legendary lines, "You with a crown of marble," to the wonderful, wonderful late Donis Davis. Um, and I was kind of like, why is this character talking about herself in the third person? And why is she saying we? Because I think in some of the original drafts, she referred to herself as Hathor wants this, Hathor wants that, and then it was we this, we that. And I thought the only person I know, and I mean, I was born and raised in South Africa via Los Angeles, now in the UK, so I have a real mishmash accent. People often say to me, "Where are you from?" But the only person I know, or people I know who refer to themselves as we, are royalty, sort of the Queen of England, the late Queen of England used, that she is we. So I was like, is she royalty? And when I went in, I said to the casting director, he said, "Do you have any questions?" And I said, "Yeah, is she royal or is she crazy?" And he was like, "Well, what do you think?" And I was like, I don't know. And they gave us very little information, very, very little, which is quite standard in auditions, which is a bit difficult and frustrating actually as an actor, because you're trying to get to the nitty gritty of what the character is, but you don't always know the wider arc. Anyway, the only thing I just kind of instinctively felt was that she had very, very high status, that she was very much accustomed to everybody doing stuff for her. So I remember sitting back in my chair and just being like, letting them come to me. And I got very quiet so that he had to kind of lean in to talk to me. Um, which I remember reading years ago, which is like, as a tactic people do. It's a very like a power play, that when you want somebody, instead of shouting, you get quieter, and then the other person has to do this. And that was that. I taped the audition and I left. And then, about when I got the job, we were about 3 or 4 days in, and Richard Dean Anderson said to me, because he had casting approval, and he said, man, it was really interesting. Like, I was watching all these tapes and I was like zipping through, the old days, VHS. It's like, I was like fast forwarding all these auditions, everything. And then boom, he's like, you just lapped off the screen. He was like, partly it was because, you were just so still. And he's like, and then you made us lean in. And I was like, yes. So I think it was that. And then obviously, I mean, they don't tell you why they pick you, but you just have to trust them when you've got the job, that you're the person that they've selected for a reason, and kind of go with what your instincts were. And obviously by then, by the time I actually shot, I had way more information that she was in fact an ancient Egyptian goddess, and also quite an evil Goa'uld, and there were all sorts of plans originally to bring her back. So I'm devastated that didn't happen.
Yeah, and Suanne, in terms of that, you mentioned there about landing the role and landing the part. And you not knowing much about the role that you're up for in terms of audition. When you landed the role and you found out that it was Stargate and you were going to be working alongside Richard Dean Anderson, an icon, a legend in terms of MacGyver, and probably up and coming actors. Michael Shanks was an up and coming actor. Amanda Tapping was up and coming. They weren't really known, but Chris Judge was still very popular at the time. He was probably well
Yeah.
established in terms of that. But in terms of Richard Dean Anderson being involved in the show, were you thinking to yourself, "Wow, this is something of a real prime time opportunity"?
Yeah, I mean, I was told what it was
Okay.
beforehand, that it was going to be a series, a spin-off of the film, and I had loved the film. I'd seen the film, and I'm not, I mean, I shouldn't say this, but I'm not massively into watching sci-fi. I'm much better now, particularly post-pandemic, where I had to do so much research for my podcast. And my husband is an avid science fiction lover, so I've got kind of into much more into it. But I really did love the film. I'm a big fan of James Spader, anyway, and well, both of them, I think, Kurt Russell also. So I like the film very much. I love Egypt. Anything to do with Egyptology is interesting. And yeah, I was delighted. I didn't know any of the other actors, and of course, it was pre-internet, so there was no Googling and looking up people before you work with them to go, oh, they're doing that, which in some ways I think is a mixed bless, like it's a blessing, because today when you can suddenly, because also often when you audition for things, unless there's a really famous star attached, you won't know who you're playing opposite until you get the job. And I've had a few things in my career where I've booked the job and then you get the call sheet and you're like, oh my God, I'm working with all these really famous people. And I'm like, well, so, but I was delighted. I mean, he was MacGyver, and then he kind of came up to me on the first day. I mean, oh God, one of my introduction to RDA was, I was standing, because initially they weren't sure how to make what they wanted Hathor's look to be. They definitely wanted it to be a kind of Cleopatra-esque sort of, throwback to kind of ancient Egypt. So there was talk about whether or not to use my own hair, but and then I had very long hair down to about here, but it's curly. And they were like, do we do it kind of like 1940s, or do we go like the classic Cleopatra wig? So they were trying various things on, and in the end, we went with the wig. Originally, it was going to be a black wig, and then somebody saw my hair color and was like, no, let's get a wig that color. But while we were in sort of hair and makeup tests, I had been called to the studio quite early. So I had my hair in curlers, no makeup on, apart from like a little bit of foundation. And I think they'd tested like some lip color. So I was sort of like, had the smear of lip color on, and then no other makeup, and hair and curlers. And eventually at about 11 o'clock, I was like, gosh, do you mind if I just get something to eat? I'm very hungry. And they're like, oh my God, of course, go and grab yourself something. So I went to go and get something. And I sort of was just taking a bite into this bagel when this voice went, hey, I'm Richard. I'm Rick. He was like, yeah, I'm Rick. How are you? And I turned, I was like, like full of food, like, I mean, horrendous. Um, so that was a good start. But no, he was a great sport and, you know, very charismatic. And the whole cast actually are phenomenal still. I still see Amanda from time to time and adore her. I saw Chris relatively recently, about 2 years ago, because we both work quite a lot in games now. We do quite a lot of voice work for games. And he just won the BAFTA for Best Gaming Character. So, you know, and I see Shanks every now and then at sort of various conventions and things, and they're all just as lovely, as welcoming, as gorgeous as they were when I met them 150 years ago.
And Suanne, can I just touch on some of the iconic scenes of Hathor and some of the memories of the show, and you might go into the bit of the background and how these actually came to pass in real life in terms of what we saw on our TV screens. And there's one sort of famous scene where you're trying to make Jack O'Neill, the Jaffa first Prime Commander. You're there with the glowing thing into his sort of a stomach, and it almost feels then the whole stomach sort of rips open, and we see this big sort of a hole where his belly button should sort of be. What was that? What was the actual make behind that? Was there a mold, a skin mold made, or
Yeah.
what did that actually look like in real life?
So that was, we did it sort of separate things. We shot the kind of master shot with him arriving and all the chit chat and the kind of close ups with me grabbing him. And then when we did the close up on the stomach, he had a prosthetic stomach that had a sort of looked like a jacket potato. It had like an X in it. That obviously that was where, you know, the Goa'uld went in. And that was attached to his stomach, and then we filmed with that. But it was quite freaky because it was really lifelike, and it was just sort of lying on a prop table, so just this like bit of his stomach hanging on the table. And my memory of working with Rick, because he's a real prankster, and so am I. I mean, there were so many laughs on on set, and I think I said this quite a lot during Hathor hosts. People would laugh and have a great time, but never ever to the detriment of the work. Like everyone took the work really seriously, but there wasn't this feeling of like, you know, oh, we're doing something so worthy that no one can have a good time. There was a real camaraderie and friendship and fun on the set. And he was just constantly making me laugh. I mean, whenever I had to do anything with the breath, because obviously the breath was superimposed afterwards. I mean, I'm talented, James, but I'm not that good. I can't just magically get pink mist out my mouth, or can I?
And
um,
yeah, yeah.
no, I was just going to say, and so whenever I would have to do the breathing, anything where I was sort of going, he would always be like, whoa, who had onions, man, for lunch? Or like, you know, I don't know. He was just always making lots of funny sounds and fart noises. There was a lot of that going on.
And Suan, the hot tub scene where you're in the water with all the baby sort of Goa'uld in terms of that floating around, hundreds of them in terms of that, and where they're sort of Daniel sort of goes crazy at the thought of when the offspring are sort of killed. In terms of that sort of scenes, what was that sort of that? Were they sort of like plastic little props sort of floating around you, or sort of things, or were they just lying in the water and they made them look to float, or were there floatable devices or stuff like that?
Yeah, it was a combination of things. So the bath was heated, sort of like to a nice temperature because I was in it for hours, to the point that I sort of, you know, when you get the kind of crinkly skin because you've been in it so long. Um, and then we had a few that were done, we had a couple that were like animatronics almost. So there were one or two that I picked up that were animated, and that was done almost like puppetry. There were guys were sitting down below the tub on the floor, moving the pieces. All the ones in the water floating were actual plastic little shrimp. I mean, I wish I'd kept one my baby prawns, my babies. But I always love to tell this story because there was like, for whatever they used, maybe it was a thing to make the plastic, I don't know, whatever was on it started to sort of emit this really pungent odor,
Okay.
which obviously was kind of quite wafty. And I reeked when I got out of that bath. And I just remember getting into the lift at the hotel, or the elevator if you're American. And literally, there was this really foul smell. And I could see people in the lift looking at me, being like, or everybody going, "It wasn't me," because I sort of stank a bit. I smelt a bit eggy. Um, but yeah, those were all little plastic shrimp. And then obviously the larger ones that I held, we had a prop that moved, and then the head was done um, afterwards in post production. I mean, it would be really interesting to see that kind of technology now,
Mm.
because they could make the Goa'ulds and like the eyes and the voice and all that. I think could be would be so like, that's probably the only thing that's really aged in the show, is
Yeah.
the kind of the technology that was around in 1998 versus now, you know?
Yeah. And in you were sort of a guess in the third episode, your final episode, Into the Fire, in terms of there was a mysteriousness about your sort of death. Was she or wasn't she? It wasn't sort of fully conclusive in terms of that. Did they lay it open in terms of possibilities that that she could have survived? It was that the whole concept that it wasn't indefinite. It seemed that there was a 90% chance that she perished, but dare I say, nothing sort of confirmative.
Yeah. I mean, it was very much left open. And the sort of final chat that we had was always like, we'd like to keep the door open that she might come back. Because I think when I did come back in the second season, those episodes tested very, very highly with audiences. So there was always talk of it coming back. And then um, my lovely friend, the late great Cliff Simon, who I knew for years prior to Stargate, but we met once or twice, like when he'd been in the show, and he was like, "Oh my God, I keep telling them, let's do an episode together." And there was kind of like a vague notion that maybe that would happen. Um, but it just never did. And, I'm heartbroken. I would have loved to have come back.
Mm. And do you think when they sort of Stargate moved towards the Ori in terms of that sort of concept, that they sort of said, right, that they put a finish on the goal sort of thing in terms of that, they moved in a different direction in terms of the Ori, in terms of that, and if the Ori storyline hadn't really taken off, do you think the possibilities would have been there for them to go back and revisit the Gold and Hathor more? Because it seemed to like they took a complete 360 when they went down this sort of route with the Ori in terms of, right, the Ori are going to be the main villains now, and they sort of push the goal sort of a lesser down the pipeline.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you have a big canon of shows like Stargate, there's sort of endless possibilities, endless avenues. But when you're writing on a hit show, they have multiple writers and multiple ideas. And, I had a brief chat with Joseph Malozzi about this, who joined after my time, sadly. But it was really insightful talking to him because, of course, as actors, we aren't really, again, you're not part of that process. You're not in the writer's room or any of the decisions that are being made about what gets cut and how it gets moved around. But he was like, it's really and it's helpful, I think, for actors to know this, because sometimes you take it personally. Like I was, even though I knew it had to come to an end, obviously for the show, it felt slightly personal,
Hmm.
which now of course I know it wasn't. They just had to move on, and for whatever reason they had other goals. They had, you know some characters also really just the public love them. Baal was one of those that what was really interesting is that sort of out of Baal, Apophis, Nearty, and Hathor, those four really seem to have resonated with people. So we were so lucky as the four of us to have been really great friends and done several conventions together, and I'm really grateful for that time that we had. But I don't know. I don't know what the thinking was exactly behind that, but I totally understand that when you have a long running show, you have to have characters evolve, come, go, new villains. Otherwise, it becomes stale and people don't want to watch the same thing over and over, you know?
Yeah. And were you excited when you heard of the spin-off of Stargate Atlantis in terms of that, or was that made known to you, or were you aware of that in terms of the time that that was sort of coming about? Did you think to yourself, right, here's an opportunity, here's an avenue that maybe this that Hathor could appear in this sort of universe with a different sort of cast, different sort of timeline in terms of that?
I actually didn't, I wasn't aware of it at the time because I think when they started, maybe their first season, but by then I had left the US. And again, like the way auditions happen now and the way auditions happen then are very different. Today, actors can be anywhere in the world. I mean, look at us, we're chatting in this way, and this can be shared instantly across the world. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that wasn't around in like early 2000, 2001. And so when I left Los Angeles, a lot of the auditions that I'd been auditioning for stuff in North America, I wasn't exposed to that anymore. And then I did become aware of Atlantis kind of, I guess, when I met people at conventions from that show. um, but that would have been amazing. It would have been wonderful to be a part of that, but again, it just wasn't the journey for my character, or for me, I guess, at this time. But, I live in eternal hope that maybe one day, maybe I can play Hathor's granny if it's if it
Just
ever comes back.
Just on that, Suanne, in terms I was speaking to two prominent actors and actresses from the Star Trek universe there last week, Kate Mulgrew, who played Janeway, and Robert Beltran, who
Oh
played
yeah,
Chakotay.
she's amazing.
Yeah, Robert Beltran, Chakotay. And 15 years or 20 years on since that now, they're actually back playing roles in an animated Star Trek series called Star Trek Prodigy, which is an animated show on Disney Plus now 20 years later. And they couldn't be more excited that they're sort of back in a different sort of timeline, but it's an
Yeah.
animated and they're playing holograms and sort of stuff like that. But I'm just wondering in terms of that sort of universe going forward, and we know that there's gripe and there's talks and there's rumors in the background that there is going to be another sort of TV sort of series in the near future. But if there was, say, something like an animated series or something like that, would that be something to interest you, to lend your voice to maybe an animated version of Cat Hatter, or something like Kate Mulgrew and Robert Beltran are doing right now at the moment, 20 years on, and couldn't be more excited about?
That would be a dream come true. So if there are any animators out there, I mean, I do a lot of voice work anyway,
Mm.
and to actually have an animated series or a spin-off or any part of that universe, that would be a dream come true. Because the other thing is, as much as I would love to play Hathor again, because I would really love to revisit her in a 2024 lens, I
Yeah,
think it would be a very different, they have over the years, there's been some sort of like criticism about like how she seduced Daniel. And I think like they're things that we could change.
yeah.
And I think the character and the go old technology and all that will have changed. um but I also know that it's unlikely I would get to play that character in that uh incarnation again. So to be able to reinvent her via some sort of voice work or an animated series would be a dream. A dream. To actually be a part of it in any way. I mean, I'll pay a doorknob, I don't care. I'm happy to be in it. Um, but yeah, I mean, wouldn't that be wonderful? I'd love that.
Yeah. And Suanne, before we go, I just want to touch on another project where you've revisited the Stargate universe. During the lockdown, you sort of set about with the Hatter host sort of concepts, 32 episodes for a full year. Was that something, what made you come about that? Was that a demand from the fans, or was it just to share stories and memories and let people know a bit more about the inside of what went on during your time on the show?
It came about because the pandemic struck and people were out of work and everyone was at home. And I suddenly had a brainwave one night going, I used to be a TV presenter. I'm going to interview every actor I've ever met and talk about their careers. I mean, I didn't really think it through too much. And then I emailed everyone I'd ever met at conventions and everyone I knew in my little database and said, "What do you think? Do you want to do it?" It's like no one's going anywhere. And everyone said yes. And then I was like, oh God, now I have to make this thing happen. But it was fantastic. And, the more we did it, the more the fans got involved, really involved. The fans were the ones who did the artwork, the themes tune, the opening video. It absolutely galvanized me and I think my profile, for want of a better word, within the community, and absolutely made me fall in love once again with Stargate and the Stargate community, who are the best fandom in the world.
Yeah. And Suanne Braun, I'm going to leave you with the most difficult question now before we sort of wrap up in terms of I've spoken to all this guests. And it's a universal question. So if you saw a few of the previous episodes, you'd be well equipped for this. If you haven't, I'm going to catch you on the hop in terms of this. So let's pretend there was a Stargate encyclopedia, a sort of dictionary as such. And they put the character Hathor into it. And let's say they left two blank sentences under her name, not really an epitaph, but a synopsis of the character. And they came to you, Suanne Braun, who played the character Hathor, and they asked you to write those sentences to describe Hathor in terms of the encyclopedia and what type of a person, individual she was. What would you like those two sentences to read?
Hathor, mother of all goddesses, no, mother of all gods, she who must always be obeyed. And
She
do
must
so, and you will be gifted plentiful and often.
plentiful and often. Okay, sounds enticing and tempting. I say you have me hooked and everyone listening on there in terms of that. You don't need to blow the imaginary kiss. I think it's in effect somewhere, the bubble in terms of that. And finally, before I let you go, one quick thing came to my mind. The legendary Don Davis, sadly, with us in an iconic part of that. What were the sort of the scenes? Because Don strikes me as a very sort of polished actor, a very serious actor. I imagine that was quite funny to have him sort of hooked under your spell in terms of him
Yeah.
more than anyone in terms of that, having say yes. Yes, Hathor, yes, my ass, in terms of that. Because I imagine that's very out of the norm for him in terms of doing stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, he's not serious at all, or wasn't serious at all. He was warm and kind of like having a big grizzly uncle on set. He was lively and funny, total professional. We had a ball. I mean, I did a convention with him in Germany, with him and Terrell, and I still have the best memories of him entertaining us endlessly with stories of early days in Hollywood and his career. He was a class act and such a lovely man, honestly. Lovely to work with, lovely to be around, and lovely to travel with.